In total, there were 33 kings of Gondor, ruling from 3320 of the Second Age to the year 2050 of the Third Age. Unlike Arnor, with Gondor, we're lucky enough to know what many of these kings were like, what their achievements were, what their failings were, and sometimes even what they were like as people. So in this video, we're going to discuss, of Gondor's 33 kings, across nearly 2,200 years of rule, who might have been the best, and why. Before I properly get into the video, I do want to make a short disclaimer. In this video, I've disqualified several kings from contention. First is Elendil, because while he was a legendary figure and was technically a High King of Gondor, he didn't truly govern Gondor. That's because Gondor was governed by his sons, the co-kings Isildur and Anarion, and I've also disqualified them, because as the actual founders of Gondor, it gives them an unfair advantage over all of their successors. And finally, I've disqualified Aragorn Alessa and his son Eldarion, because while there is absolutely continuation between Gondor and the reunited kingdom that Alessa ruled, I still do consider it a separate entity. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about who the best king of Gondor was. Now, I'm going to cheat a little because I don't think there is an objective best king of Gondor. I think you could make a decent argument about 5 or so different kings at least, but to avoid it feeling like I'm reaching, I'm going to talk about 3 different kings, and you guys in the comment section can talk about whether you agree or not. That said, I'm not going to sit on the fence, and at the end of the video, I will mention who I believe was the greatest king, and why. The first king I want to put into contention is Tarannon Falastur, the Lord of the Coasts. He was the 12th king of Gondor, ruling from 830 to 913 of the Third Age, a total of 83 years. At the start of Tarannon's life, Gondor was much smaller in scope and power, mostly being confined to the lands either side of the Anduin and Belfalas in the west. A few centuries earlier, King Turambar had won plenty of new territory in the east, but this was in response to Easterling attacks, and these new lands were mostly empty, and Gondor made very little effort to colonize them. But this would change with the coming of Tarannon, perhaps Gondor's first true expansionist king, and the first of what would be known as the Ship Kings. Before he was even crowned, Tarannon began to conquer new lands for Gondor, along the coasts south and westwards of the Anduin. Thus, the lands west of Belfalas, commonly known as Anfalas, would be brought under Gondor's control around this time, and would remain so for the rest of the Third Age. On top of that, Gondor would now have a presence in Harondor, known as South Gondor, and it would take around 2,000 years for the Gondorians to be completely driven from that land. To commemorate these conquests, when Tarannon finally became king in 830, he would take the name Falastur, Lord of the Coasts. Tarannon's conquests would lead to Gondor becoming entangled with the Haradrim who dwelt in Harad, and at the time, the Black Númenóreans of Umbar and the lands to the south. At first, it seems Tarannon wished to try and resolve this ancient feud diplomatically, and he ended up wedding Baruthiel, a Black Númenórean princess. However, this marriage was a disaster, and Baruthiel was exiled back to her homeland. This probably ensured that war between Gondor and the Black Númenóreans would be inevitable, but this would be the task for Tarannon's successors. When he died in 913, this war had seemingly not reached a boiling point. And perhaps Tarannon's successors were his greatest legacy. Tarannon was an extremely capable ruler, a militarist who wished to expand Gondor's power, and his successors would inherit these traits. As I said earlier, Tarannon was known as the first Ship King, and there would be 3 more that followed, and by the end, Gondor reigned supreme over both Umbar and Harad. Although Tarannon was long dead by the conclusion of these wars, he was undoubtedly the one who got the ball rolling, and for that, he deserves a huge amount of credit. In saying that, succession was perhaps Tarannon's greatest failing too. You see, Tarannon was Gondor's first childless king. Although it ended up being fine as his nephew, Eärnil, was able to take over, it did set a precedent, and following Tarannon, 2 more kings would die childless, and it became a common problem through the House of Narion. In the end, the death of a childless king was what caused the end of the line of kings until Aragorn reclaimed the throne 1,000 years later. That's not to say that Tarannon bears some responsibility for the end of the line of kings. I mean, it ended over 1,000 years after his death, but it was the first manifestation of what would become a major problem. Our second king is another of the Ship Kings, and that is Ciryaher, who would become known as the legendary Hyarmendacil I. Hyarmendacil was the 15th king of Gondor, and the 4th and last of the Ship Kings, who ruled from 1015 to 1149 of the Third Age. In his youth, Hyarmendacil got to witness the start of the over 100-year-long war that he would be the one to eventually finish. In 933, Eärnil would finish the construction of his Grand Fleet and used it to conquer Umbar, driving the Black Númenóreans into the desert. However, Eärnil would perish at sea alongside much of his fleet during a storm, leaving the throne to Ciryandil, Hyarmendacil's father. Ciryandil immediately got to work rebuilding Gondor's fleet, but the Black Númenóreans and the Haradrim were not about to wait. They laid siege to Umbar, but were unable to take the city thanks to Gondor constantly being able to reinforce and resupply the city by sea. However, in 1015, King Ciryandil fell in the fighting, thus Ciryaher, the future Hyarmendacil, took the throne. Hyarmendacil immediately recognised the problem. Although Umbar could not fall due to the power of Gondor's navy, the siege wouldn't be relieved unless the power of Harad was crushed on land. So Hyarmendacil spent the next 35 years amassing a powerful army to deal with the Haradrim once and for all. And in 1050, Hyarmendacil unleashed his army. The Black Númenóreans were so utterly crushed that they never became a problem in the region again. Much of the coast of Harad was conquered, and the Haradrim kings were forced to pay tribute to Gondor. So complete was Hyarmendacil's victory that Harad would not trouble Gondor again for another 400 years, and that was only thanks to a Gondorian civil war. So it's no surprise that Hyarmendacil, then known as Ciryaher, would take the name he would be remembered by, as Hyarmendacil means South of Victor. The next 100 years of Hyarmendacil's reign are widely considered the zenith of Gondor's power. It had reached its territorial maximum, and its enemies in both the south and east had been defeated and subdued. The wealth of Gondor was unmatched, as was the strength of its army and navy. So it should come as no surprise when I say that Gondor's power at this time could only be weakened from within, and that leads us to Hyarmendacil's one major failure, his son, Etanatar II Alcarin, Etanatar the Glorious. But all of Etanatar's glory was actually his father's. Etanatar himself was a lazy man who loved luxury. Thus, the peak of Gondor was short. Hyarmendacil's powerful kingdom immediately began to stagnate after his death in the hands of his son. And to make matters worse, Etanatar's two sons, who would both be kings, were much the same. You obviously can't lay all the blame on a parent for how their child turns out. But we don't know how Hyarmendacil raised Etanatar, so all we can say is, perhaps you could blame him. Although the son and grandsons of Hyarmendacil would grow up to be lazy, incapable rulers, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that is our third candidate, Minalcar, or as he would be known, Romendacil II, the 19th king of Gondor, who officially ruled between 1304 and 1366. Just as how Hyarmendacil was born in time to meet Tarannon, Romendacil was born just in time to meet Hyarmendacil. The old king died when Romendacil was aged 23. It's lucky that Romendacil might have learned a thing or two from his great-grandfather, because following Hyarmendacil's death, Gondor would be left in the hands of the aforementioned Etanatar, and then in the hands of Narmakil I, and then briefly in the hands of Calmakil, Narmakil's younger brother, and the father of Romendacil. These three men all shared a common trait: laziness. So Gondor endured the 77-year-long reign of Etanatar, in which it began to stagnate, and following that it endured 14 years of Narmakil. But to give Narmakil credit, he recognised that Romendacil was a vigorous, capable man, so in 1240, in an unprecedented move, Narmakil named Romendacil as Regent of the Realm, effectively giving him the powers of the king. With these new powers, Romendacil immediately got to work, his chief concern, the Northmen and the Easterlings. The eventual alliance between Gondor and Rohan can be traced back to Romendacil's efforts here. He wanted the Northmen as allies, so he began favouring a powerful prince among them, Vidogavia, the self-styled king of Rhovanion. To empower Vidogavia and to dissuade any Northmen who might be disloyal, Romendacil then marched east with an army to crush the resurgent Easterlings. He was successful and took Romendacil as his name, meaning East Victor. Finally, to completely cement the alliance between Gondor and the Northmen, he sent his son, Valacar, to dwell in Rhovanion as an ambassador in 1250. To commemorate these great victories, Romendacil ordered the building of the Argonath along the shores of the Anduin, the massive twin statues of Isildur and Anarion. Keep in mind, all of this was done before Romendacil was actually king. He was still just the regent. He would not become king for another 54 years, and then, after that, he would rule in his own name for another 62, bringing his total time in power to 126 years. In this time, he reversed Gondor's stagnation, defeated the Easterlings, built the Argonath, and most importantly, secured a lasting alliance with the Northmen, who provided a buffer against the eastern lands, and also provided Gondor with manpower and a strong force of cavalry. Unfortunately, Romendacil's successes also ended up creating future problems. While the Northmen were a powerful asset for Gondor, not all Gondorians saw them as a good thing. Traditionalists saw them as lesser men who would hasten Gondor's decline, and on top of that, Valakar would create controversy by marrying a Northman woman, and having a half-Northman son, planting the seeds for the future kin-strife civil war that would devastate Gondor. It's hard to blame Romendacil for this. We know he raised Valakar fine, as Valakar ended up being a capable king, and it's not like he could have annulled Valakar's marriage without angering the Northmen. But, as I said earlier, it goes to show that Romendacil may have been a victim of his own success. Okay, so those are the 3 candidates, and I promised at the start of the video that I would choose one. So, who do I believe is the best? Honestly, it's gotta be Romendacil. While Tarannon didn't really have any true failings, and while Hyarmendacil ruled Gondor at its zenith, Romendacil's actions had the longest lasting impact in my opinion. While Tarannon's and Hyarmendacil's conquests in Harad would eventually evaporate as Gondor declined, Gondor's alliance with the Northmen would continue through the rest of the Third Age, and that's the alliance that Romendacil created. Even when traditionalists within Gondor saw the Northmen as something that would weaken Gondor, Romendacil recognised their usefulness and potential, and this would turn out to be true when, over 1,000 years later, Gondor was saved by Eorl the Young and then Theoden King. You also have to measure the individual from the circumstances in which they emerged from. Tarannon emerged from a peaceful, prosperous Gondor. Hyarmendacil emerged from a nation at war, but his predecessors were some of Gondor's greatest kings, and he had access to a powerful navy and army. Romendacil emerged from a Gondor that was beginning to weaken under the hand of bad kings. Sure, Gondor was still very powerful, and because of that, it would have been easy for him to end up like his father, his uncle, and his grandfather. Instead, Romendacil decided to be the opposite, shouldered extra responsibility, and was proactive in dealing with Gondor's enemies. Before I end the video, I want to talk about a couple of honourable mentions. There's the aforementioned Eärnel I for conquering Umbar in the first place, the city which would anchor Gondor's power in Harad for the next 500 years. There's Eldacar, who faced a civil war through no fault of his own, but eventually defeated Castamir the Usurper. There's Tarondor, who led Gondor in the aftermath of the Great Plague and made the wise decision to move the capital to Minas Anor, later Minas Tirith. There's Telummatar, who wiped out Castamir's final descendants in a daring capture of Umbar. And there's Eärnil II, the second last king of Gondor, who, if I made space for a 4th king in this video, would have probably been my pick. He who saved Gondor from Haradrim and the Wain Riders after King Ondahur was killed. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you have a different conclusion to myself, please do post it in the comments. Honestly, I would find it hilarious if you find a way to spin Atanatar or Eärnur as the best kings of Gondor. I know someone will inevitably ask me to do a video about Arnor's best kings, and as much as I would love to do that, we have very little information about the vast majority of them. But if you want it, I will oblige. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to be the best king, don't just build one giant statue, build 2.